Welcome to part 3 of our economics unit. In our previous video, we talked about some of the um, major ideas of different economic markets and some of the figures in economics, notably Adam Smith and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the creators essentially of communism. We're going to finish this video series with one more important aspect where economics and philosophy overlap, as well as some general terminology, and then we'll end by reviewing a little bit about globalization. An idea that has effects in both economics and philosophy is the theory of utilitarianism. And this is associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both of whom were active in the 19th century. And what utilitarianism argues is that governments and individuals and economies should be interested in what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And John Stuart Mill particularly argued that government needed to intervene in the economy, that a fully laissez-faire economy wasn't in the people's best interest to ensure both justice and reforms. And a thought experiment that has become associated with utilitarianism is the trolley problem. And the trolley problem gets mentioned in popular culture somewhat regularly. If a few years ago you watched the series The Good Place, it was illustrated very vividly and very memorably in one of the episodes. The trolley problem is essentially this: you are the conductor of a trolley that can only go forward, you cannot stop it. The trolley, when the track splits, if you throw a switch, the trolley will turn onto the other piece of track. But again, you can't stop it, you can't put it in reverse, it is only going forward. You are coming up to one of those places where the track splits. If you go straight ahead, in other words, if you do not throw the switch, throw the lever, there are 5 people tied to the trolley tracks. You will crush them if you go forward. If you pull the lever to change tracks or to go off on the side track, you will save those 5 people, but there is one person tied to that side track, and that person will then die. And so the question is, do you do nothing and cause inadvertently, well, arguably inadvertently, the deaths of 5 people, or do you do something and save those 5 people, but then kill one person through your action of flipping the lever? That's the trolley problem. And what John Stuart Mill probably would have argued is that you should do what's best for the most people. So you should flip that lever and you should save 5 people at the cost of killing one, rather than doing nothing and killing 5 people. I am not making that argument. I don't know what I would do. But it's an interesting thought experiment. And it illustrates the idea of utilitarianism, that what utilitarians argue is they want to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Obviously, in the real world, we can argue about things like what really is the greatest good. So moving from that sort of theoretical, philosophical things to some terminology. GDP and GNP. GDP stands for gross domestic product. That is the total value of goods and services produced within a country's borders, and it's usually used as a shorthand way of how strong the country's economy is when we're looking at GDP growth. GDP growth is how much the gross domestic product has grown over a quarter or compared to a quarter a year ago. Gross national product used to be used for this, and you might see it in older materials. This is slightly different. So GDP is everything produced within a country's borders, no matter who produced it. So if Toyota, which is a Japanese company, has a car factory in the United States, that counts towards the United States' gross domestic product because it's occurring in the US. On the other hand, if Ford, an American car company, has a factory in China, That factory counts towards China's GDP, not towards the United States' GDP. It's within a country's borders. GNP, on the other hand, is the value of goods and services produced by citizens of a country or by companies headquartered in a country worldwide. So you see how they're slightly different. Today, we most commonly use GDP, but you will still sometimes see GNP used in older materials. It is often reported per capita. Per capita means per person. So you take the total value of goods and services produced and you divide it by the number of people. GDP is also reported often for states. So we could talk about the GDP of Minnesota or Wisconsin or Iowa. Um, Maybe for metropolitan areas as well. You might that I haven't seen that really a lot, but states definitely. So I originally made this PowerPoint about 4 years ago, and so my next slide is going to seem like it's political, and I don't intend it to be. And my next slide is about tariffs, which have been in the news lately for the first time in a pretty long time that they made the popular news as opposed to the business news. Tariffs are not new. Tariffs have existed for a very, very long time. And a tariff, of course, is essentially a tax on an import or an export. What's brought into a country or what's brought out of a country. And tariffs used to be a primary source of government revenue before income taxes were made constitutional in the early 20th century. Of course, at that time, government spending was much, much less. And it was much, much less in really all areas of the government. Um, People often mention that, of course, social welfare is a 20th century invention in certainly in the American government, and that's true. Uh, but the other thing to remember is that before the 20th century, the U.S. did not have a large military and did not spend nearly as much money on the military, even accounting for inflation and things like that, as it does today. Because traditionally in the U.S., um, traditionally in the early U.S. especially, Americans were deathly opposed to the idea of a standing army. The military was associated with oppression from British colonial days. And so the growth of the U.S. military after World War II was something that was dramatically different than the first 150 years of the country's existence, where the military was only grown in the case of a war, the Civil War, the Spanish American War, World War I, and initially World War II. But then the military stayed a very large part of the country after World War II. I'm not arguing that's good or bad. I'm just pointing out that that is a 20th century thing that was not known in the 19th century. And that late 18th century would have probably horrified Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and their friends and rivals. Um, so again, used to be the primary source of government revenue. Um, since then, has also been used as a way to try across the world to protect industries, including agriculture, where tariffs are um, levied on other goods to make them more expensive to try to make local manufacturers or local farmers' goods more competitive in the marketplace. Most economists would argue that extensive tariffs are not good for the economy, that it's very much in keeping with the old idea of mercantilism. Um, so let's go on with some miscellaneous vocabulary. Um, I don't know if I've mentioned sort of in passing monopoly. We all know what a monopoly is, probably from playing the game. It's where one company controls an industry. An oligopoly is similar, except it is a group of companies or a group of individuals that control an industry. Inflation, of course, is where prices rise rapidly. Deflation is where prices decline rapidly. And deflation, people often, we think that's a good idea, but it's actually very economically bad as well. Stagflation combines a poor economy, like no growth in gross domestic product, along with high inflation. And stagflation is most commonly associated with the late 1970s. A recession is an economy that is in decline. It means that the gross domestic product has shrunk, um, has shrunk over several months or several quarters. A depression is essentially a severe recession. An old joke is something to the effect of a recession is my neighbor was laid off from their job. A depression means I am unemployed from my job. And that just implies that it's not really, there aren't clearly agreed on definitions of how to distinguish between a recession and a depression. Everyone knows a depression is more severe, but whether it is a depression or not is largely a matter of perspective and of politics and other things, whether someone wants to believe it is or not. And then a few weeks ago, for some of you, I asked you to watch globalization videos. For others, it may have been more recent. And I'm not going to go over all of that because you watch those videos, but I just want to point out that we can have debates about positives and negatives of globalization. And I think that most people would agree that there are both positives and negatives. Now, some people will argue that the negatives outweigh the positives, and some will argue that the positives outweigh the negatives. I'm not sure which of those is true, but it is something to think about. So, some common positives that are associated with globalization include things like increased living standards, increased sharing of cultures and cultural knowledge, improvements in medicine and life expectancy, improvements in agriculture and food supplies. Potential negatives of globalization include things like environmental consequences, including pollution. One of the videos that probably asked you to watch talked about changes in family structure as individualism has increased in a global world, and economic displacement as jobs move to different places. Although at times the overall economy is strengthened by that, individuals, the microeconomic side of things, can often go through a lot of negatives as well. So, positives and negatives behind globalization. Obviously, these are not exhaustive lists. You can probably think of many, many more. So in this video, we talked about the trolley problem and John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. We talked obviously about globalization, and we talked about some terminology, including GDP, gross domestic product, depression, recession, stagflation, and other vocabulary that is commonly used in economics. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck as you move forward in your learning.